I'm Michael Walker, and this is TyskySour. Tonight I am joined by Novara Media co-founder and contributing editor, author of The Bible of Millennial Socialism, Fully Automated Luxury Communism. It is Aaron Bastani.
How you doing, Michael?
I'm very well. I'm not panicked yet about going on public transport based on, like when people sneeze. We'll get to that stage a little bit later, probably. I'm also joined by Paul Sweeney, who was the MP for North East Glasgow until the catastrophe that was the 2019 general election. You will probably recognise Paul Sweeney from a previous episode of TyskySour. What did we talk about? Probably mainly Scotland, I think, at that point.
Grace
Scotland
was
and
on.
Brexit.
Yeah, Grace was on, so we had a good chat about the economics and stuff like that. So, interesting.
Tonight we are going to talk about the Labour leadership. So there was a Sky debate last night. Pressure is still building on Keir Starmer to reveal his funders because Rebecca Long-Bailey and Lisa Nandy both have by now. We're then going to talk about coronavirus, which is on the move and has potentially caught our government and Boris Johnson off guard. We'll finish by talking about the events in Bolivia last November, in which the military forced Bolivian President Evo Morales to stand down after disputing the validity of elections. It's now been made apparent by a study by MIT that those elections were in fact fair, meaning Morales' deposition was a coup. So this is, puts shame on many centrist voices and establishments in this country who mocked the Labour leader and other people on the left when they called it a coup, which it has turned out to be. Anyway, more of that later. We're going to start with the Labour leadership. We usually have a bit of a Becky bent on this show. So me and Aaron have both come out for Rebecca Long-Bailey. It's good to have someone in the studio from a different perspective. Paul, I know you're a Keir leader, a Keir stan.
I wouldn't describe myself as a stan. Probably someone on balance who's going to give him a preference. Yeah. I'm not sure, actually. I'm finding it hard to make my mind up. The more I listen to the discussions and the debates, it actually shows that there's a lot of power in the movement when you see the level of consensus that's emerging. I think some of the disagreements have been somewhat trivial. We mentioned things about funders and visibility, but actually the general thrust of policy, it's great to see that the Labour Party's developed a degree of consensus, and I think that's a great legacy of what Corbyn achieved, particularly around an avowedly anti-austerity platform. When we look at the apologism that went on after the 2015 election, when we had that interim period of leadership, and it cast such a huge shadow. Not only did we lose the first red wall, which was the one between Glasgow and Edinburgh, but we also then compounded it by sort of pandering to austerity politics to an extent, or at least visible, even though technically we didn't in terms of the final vote on these sorts of things like the welfare cap, but the optics really didn't work well, and some of the rhetoric at that time almost rubbed salt in the wounds, So I think the legacy of Corbynism is that we've really shifted fundamentally as a party back to our roots as a working class trade union movement, and I think that's something to be celebrated in this contest.
Right, so you might not be quite standing for Starmer, but you're really all in for Rayner, right? All in for
totally.
Angela.
Yeah, I mean, Angela's been fantastic. Having worked with her in the last 2.5 years in Parliament, she came up and campaigned for me in the general election. What I saw in her really connected with working class voters in my constituency, and that's the kind of narrative that Labour really needs when we're talking about rebuilding a red wall, between Hull and Liverpool, but also need to rebuild the red wall between Glasgow and Edinburgh. And to do that, you need someone who's going to have a clear analysis based on class.
I like this. Lisa Nandy's got not the red wall, the red bridge, and you've got not the red wall, but two fucking red walls.
Yeah, the Antonine Wall and the Hadrian's Wall.
We're going to talk a bit about the leadership election in a moment. First of all, let's go to a clip. This was Starmer in action last night. It was the Sky debate. I don't think there were any, there weren't any huge takeaways. It definitely wasn't a game changer, but we might as well show you some of it. So this is Keir Starmer. He's been asked whether or not the Brexit policy was a disaster.
So far as Brexit is concerned, what we were trying to do was to protect ourselves from what Johnson was going to do. I didn't vote for Boris Johnson's deal because I thought that it was a very bad deal and it would end up in a really bad place. Now today, the white paper's been published, and it's obvious where Johnson's going to go next. It's got no deal or nearly no deal written all over it, and it's communities in Dewsbury and elsewhere that are going to pay the price. And that's why I didn't vote for Johnson's deal, because as soon as I saw what he put on the table, I thought it would end in the way that's been set out today.
The questions about Labour's Brexit policy. Do you take responsibility for the policy as Shadow Brexit Secretary that Lisa Nandy has just described as a disaster?
I take responsibility for everything in our manifesto. It was actually a Shadow Cabinet decision. It was actually a decision of our whole party at party conference. But I'm not going to shirk from that. But I do. There's a since we're looking at what happens next, Leave Remain is over. So that divide is not there. We've left the EU. So whether you were for Remain or Leave is irrelevant. But there's a big test coming up for all of us.
Okay, because we have spent a long time with you.
The question is, now Johnson is heading for no deal or nearly no deal. If we become leader of the Labour Party, will we take him on or we will give in to him? And that's the question we need to answer.
That was Keir Starmer explaining why he designed the Brexit policy, which he did. I mean, I said this on the show before. I get a little bit worried when Keir Starmer is talking about or suggesting that the government are desperate to have a no deal, because I feel like he's setting the bar way too low. I also think it would be unlikely, to say the least, that the Conservative government do at this point want no deal. I mean, they ran on a platform of getting Brexit done. I think for them to now have a huge standoff where they leave in an economically damaging way would be a bit bizarre. So I would avoid that particular framing if I was Keir Starmer, but I don't know what you think, Paul.
Well, I mean, part of the risk that we had was gifting the territory to the Tories where they were able to fight in a strong position, particularly in the general election. The big assumption we made was that Johnson couldn't go and get a deal. He did it through slightly underhand means by basically throwing the DUP under a bus and exposing, the fragility of the union, particularly with Northern Ireland, when you're going to have a hard border down the Irish Sea. That's not really cut through. That was often seen off limits by any reasonable player in that game. Johnson kind of subverted those rules and it threw in the air all the planning assumptions we'd made as a party. So our party conference, I think, the position we arrived at after the mother of all composites, I think 2 years running, didn't cut the mustard. It wasn't equivocal enough. It was too equivocal. It didn't come down clearly in a narrative that was credible. Also, we weren't able to find cooperation in the centre left, with the Liberal Democrats or anyone else to try and achieve a breakthrough in Parliament. So in that context, we were screwed really going into an election in that time frame after Johnson was able to seen to be delivering and we were seen to be dithering.
I'm going to move on to a surprising turn in the Labour leadership election, which is the suggestion that Keir Starmer is Britain's Bernie Sanders. I think there are many arguments to elect Keir Starmer. I mean, obviously, I'm not fully buying all of them, but I think there are many strong reasons to say that Keir Starmer is the right leader for Labour at this point in time. Him being Bernie Sanders wasn't one that I'd considered previously, but there was a comment piece which went a bit viral on Twitter this week by Patrick Maguire, who's politics correspondent at the New Statesman. The headline of this article originally was Keir Starmer is the British Bernie Sanders, but then I think they changed it because the author was sort of like, you're kind of misrepresenting my position. But in any case, I'll read out the first paragraph of that article. So Patrick Maguire writes, which Labour leadership candidate has most in common with Bernie Sanders? Few of the Democratic presidential candidates' admirers on the British left would say the answer was Keir Starmer. Yet that is precisely the comparison the favourite for the Labour leadership wants 580,000 members and supporters to make as they begin to cast their ballots this week. It's an implicit rebuke to Lisa Nandy and Rebecca Long-Bailey. Starmer says he is not just in the business of uniting a fractured party at Westminster, but broadening its base in the country. Cultivating new support across class and ethnic divides has put Sanders on the road to the Democratic nomination. And Starmer believes that the same approach can put Labour back on the path to power, keep left, rebuild a diverse coalition of voters, and look beyond the red wall. Are you buying this argument, Aaron?
I don't think he's Labour's Bernie Sanders. I think the closest thing sociologically, politically, in terms of personality type, the closest thing Britain's going to have to Bernie Sanders is Jeremy Corbyn. I think he's from that same age cohort. He comes from a similar sort of political background, interested in foreign policy. He has a similar, like I say, personality type. He's quite straight down the line. He's always been viewed as an outsider within his political party. These are all both good things. They can also be seen as both good things and bad things, right? So I think it's just, and look, Sanders might not win the presidency for some of the reasons I've just said. He might not even win the nomination. I think he should win the nomination, but he might not win the nomination. He's going to win the plurality of delegates. So I think it's stupid. I think clearly the closest thing we've had to Bernie Sanders in this country was Jeremy Corbyn. And look, The Guardian attacked him for 4 or 5 years for a range of things. First of all, it was because he was unelectable. Then in 2017, Labour got 40% of the vote. It was for a range of other things. You might think some are more valid than others. But they responded to the British Bernie Sanders in quite a negative and often hostile way.
So that was, I mean, what's interesting about that article is I think by changing the headline, Patrick Maguire was sort of trying to distance himself from it, which suggests that actually maybe it was briefed from Starmer's camp, who were sort of suggesting, no, look, Keir Starmer is Britain's Bernie Sanders. The background's slightly confusing there. We're going to move on to another Starmer stan who is not trying to compare Keir Starmer to Bernie Sanders, but is in fact disavowing Bernie Sanders. This is, of course, London Mayor Sadiq Khan. He told Politico this week that, in fact, he thought the Democrats should nominate billionaire Mike Bloomberg or billionaire-backed South Bend mayor and Obama impersonator Pete Buttigieg. So we can go to that article in Politico. I asked Khan if he's hoping Trump will lose in November. Of course I am, he says. I like good guys and good women to win rather than bad guys. The key thing for the Democrats is to choose somebody who can beat Trump. I think Mike Bloomberg is interesting. He clearly gets under Trump's skin. If it's Bloomberg versus Trump, it will be a really interesting campaign. 2 New Yorkers, one of whom is a successful self-made billionaire, the other one, less successful, lost his dad's money, doing less well. Khan knows how to wind Trump up. I think Buttigieg is interesting, he adds. I'd query whether Sanders or Warren or Biden would do as well. But let's wait and see. Are you falling into the Starmer and Bloomberg camp?
No, it's bizarre sort of cognitive dissonance going on there, isn't it? I mean, I think I've seen a picture of Bloomberg on the golf course with Trump, so they're clearly not that far apart. He was a Republican for a long time and switched during the Bush presidency, second one. So I don't see the parallels there at all. Obviously, he get absolutely hounded on the debates when he entered in over his sort of, potential misogyny and abuse allegations and so on. So he's clearly got a lot of skeletons in the closet, not a particularly pleasant guy. Obviously, a capitalist that represents the 1%. So any sort of parallels in terms of class analysis are just not valid. Buttigieg, I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't know. It's like a preferred focus grouped version.
You think he focus grouped how to ask people to spell it, how to ask people to pronounce his name?
It seems like that, doesn't it?
Mayor Pete was focus group.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that was. I think that's known, isn't it?
I mean,
I'd presume it. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I find that kind of these kind of characters quite sinister, actually, because of the lack of visibility of what their politics are, where they've emerged from, what's their story really, and just the kind of blandness of their rhetoric and the blandness of their analysis. It's like one of these sort of number 8 balls you could just shake and get some sort of platitude that appears on it. They read out. It's just pathetic, really.
There's a great video. Oh, it's a shame we don't have it up. Actually, there's a great video of Trump and Buttigieg not on a golf course, but they are trying hot dogs from a female hot dog stand and a male hot dog stand. I presume it's from the Apprentice.
Oh, right.
So they're sort of competing over who can make the best hot dogs in New York. And they're very chummy. Mike Bloomberg sort of like talking about how the beautiful ladies have already won the competition by being so hot.
Jesus.
It's all a little bit
He talks
gross.
about his busty 16-year-old daughter going on holiday with him in China. And he's got 60, how many women? 69 women or 69 people?
64 people with NDAs.
Yeah, outstanding.
Yeah.
Obviously not all relating to sexual harassment or whatever, but some will be.
Well,
Some are.
Well, he's made the decision to release 3 of them, which to me seems slightly like the worst of both worlds.
Benevolent,
Well, because it's also, if you choose which ones to release, then people are obviously going to assume that they're the best 3, right? So it seems like an odd decision for him to make.
Well, Sadiq Khan's kind of saying that Biden's too left. I don't get it, or just he can't win. But then Bloomberg can't win. I don't quite understand.
Well, it's interesting the point you made, the parallels with Jeremy, because the big difference in this election that we just had was the hugely polarizing effect of a binary referendum. That's not something that's really a factor in American politics right now. So the coalition that was able to be built by Labour in 2017 is something that's more similar to what's happening in America now. And when you see the disruption and the dislocation that was caused by, we've seen 2 parallels in Scotland and in Brexit, with referendums really polarising working class people. It's not something as a feature of American politics. It's something that's more readily buildable by the left. And it's something that's been a real challenge for us in the UK.
Do you think the presidential system favours Sanders? And do you think that Corbyn, because of the things we talked about, the personality type, the outsider status, in a parliamentary system, you have to get a lot of people behind you within the party? Do you think that system favours Sanders?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, it creates that dynamic where it's all focused on the individual. You know, sometimes it can backfire if you get a really unpopular sort of leader, certainly in this country. You know, you have to then make the argument, it's about the candidate, in the parliamentary system rather than the leader. So it swings and roundabouts, really, isn't it? But I think, it might well favour him if he's seen as a credible, rebuke to 40 years of neoliberalism in America, where wages have stagnated. There's an ever-decreasing share of national wealth going to workers and wages, which is a parallel with this country. And I think our arguments and our analysis still are valid here, but it's been crowded out by the constitutional arguments over Brexit and, in the case of Scotland, independence.
It seems like Sadiq Khan also hasn't looked at the empirical evidence, so we can look at what the polls are suggesting about who is most likely to beat Donald Trump. So from the Real Clear Politics averages, this is sort of the gold standard in American polling. They put together all the different polls that are being done about the head-to-heads between the Democratic leaders and Donald Trump and find the averages. Sanders, according to Real Clear Politics, or according to current polling, would beat Trump 49.6% to 44.9%, so that's plus 4.7. Buttigieg in these polls beats Trump also, but only by 2, and Bloomberg beats Trump, but only by 4. Obviously, this is in the popular vote, so Hillary Clinton also won the popular vote, and the key to this election is going to be those swing states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio. Lots of polls have come out this week showing that it's only, there were a couple that showed it was only Bernie that wins Wisconsin. You could also say, Michael, but this doesn't take the account of the dynamics of the debate. So potentially it's just that Bernie Sanders is more famous, and the moment he stands in front of a debate hall, he's going to crumble. Well, again, we have some more empirical evidence that suggests that's not the case. So people who viewed the most recent Democratic debate thought it would be Bernie who would be most likely to beat Donald Trump. So that's specifically people who saw him and thought this is the kind of performance that's going to beat Trump. Bernie was on 34%, Biden was on 25%, Bloomberg on 15%, Warren on 11%, and Buttigieg on 8%.
Can I say this also feeds into the whole, is Keir Starmer Britain's Bernie Sanders? Bernie Sanders and Corbyn were similar in another way, Corbyn albeit unsuccessfully in 2019, in that Bernie Sanders is saying, I can win back blue-collar workers in Rust Belt states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, these places that Democrats have to win back. And I don't think Keir Starmer is saying, I'm best placed to win back the sort of British equivalent of the Rust Belt. What they are saying is we can build a broad coalition, ex-Lib Dems, Remain vote. Those are the first, instinctively, what I'm thinking. Remain voters.
Well, I think the implicit assumption is also that I don't know if this is correct or not, but the tendency towards deference among sort of parts of the British electorate will find Sir Keir Starmer more like acceptable to them than terrorist-loving Jeremy Corbyn.
He might win those people
They'll have
back.
made Keir Starmer terrorist-loving.
He might win those people back, but my point is Sanders is trying to articulate a working-class message to blue-collar workers in places which specifically voted for Trump last time.
He has a message and a vision which Starmer as yet doesn't have.
Isn't explicitly saying
Well,
that.
it's something that probably Nandi's been the most explicit about in her sort of her points that she's been making during the campaign.
She's explicit about the problem. She's not explicit about the solutions.
Well, that's fair.
Anyone can pose questions. I do it all the time.
Well, that's fair. But I think, as a dispassionate observer, on the leadership, certainly, I think it's clear to me that there's no route back to power for Labour unless we are effectively communicating with a lot of voters. And I think we sometimes overcook it. I think credibility is a big factor. And certainly, in my conversations with constituents, Keir Starmer is, someone who interests a cohort of voters who are probably older and are looking for that kind of, like you say, statesman-like figure. But I don't know if there will be the same kind of people who were excited by Corbyn. So there's a lot of younger people, a lot of students who don't normally vote necessarily for Labour or vote at all, who are really excited by Jeremy. And that's why, in some parts of my constituency, we had a huge amount of Labour posters up. We had a huge amount of visible activity in favour of Labour, but they were very much in the student parts of the constituency.
One more point on Keir Starmer and Bernie Sanders, and then we're going to move on to coronavirus. You're watching TyskySour, you're watching Novara Media. please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please subscribe on our website to go to support.novaramedia.com. Donate us the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month so we can keep doing regular shows. We're going to start making more mini documentaries. And we don't get funded by billionaires or billionaire backers or people backed by billionaires.
The alt-right have the Koch brothers. They have big business presenting themselves as advancing working class politics.
The New European have the Lord Sainsbury's of the world. He donated £8 million to the Lib Dems in the last general election. The Lib Dems made more in the 2019 general election than the Labour Party for their, what was it,
in the final quarter of 2019.
That's the general election, right? They just released the final quarter figures for that general election.
The largest swing of any party in the last election as well, and that in many cases that tipped many seats blue. Because it ate into the Labour vote. So when we're
Lib Dem wreckers.
When we're walking the red wall, maybe that's a pitch for a working title for a documentary you're going to do. I don't know, but walking the red wall.
Walking the red wall.
You can look at how
we're not as cheesy as that, Paul.
Okay, maybe that's.
Can I also say,
Buttigieg, wasn't it? Yeah.
We've got 900 people watching. Smash the like button. Doesn't cost you a thing. Like manners, it's free and much appreciated.
All right, final point. I know you're going to disagree with us on this one because you've already intimated towards it whether the funding question matters. So one difference between Starmer and Bernie Sanders is that Bernie Sanders made transparency about political funders one of his key causes, taking big money out of politics. On that very issue, Starmer is dragging his feet. Pressure mounted on him yesterday as Lisa Nandy joined Rebecca Long-Bailey in releasing her campaign accounts. So Keir is the only one in the leadership election who hasn't released his. Before talking about this, we're going to go to Starmer answering Peston when he was asked about this on Wednesday night.
This one, who funds you? We had that tons of times, and that's because your competitor, Becky Long-Bailey, yesterday published her donors. Largely the Unite Union and Momentum, and indeed the CWU.
Yeah.
Who's funding you?
Well, Robert, as you know, there are very strict rules. The Electoral Commission and the parliamentary rules require you to register all your funding and then to publish it. And that's what we've been doing. My first tranche went up on the parliamentary website a few weeks ago. The next tranche is
presumably the big tranche.
Well, the next tranche is with the parliament. We've given it to the parliamentary authorities.
Sure.
They need to now. I've got a compliance team. The parliamentary authorities are looking at it. They check it's all in order, and I think it's going up as soon as they give it the green light, which will probably be on Monday of next week.
That was Keir Starmer's very loyally. That's loyally. It's a difficult word to say, isn't it? Answer to Peston there. Paul, what do you think he has to hide?
I don't think he's got anything to hide. I just think, it's going to come out anyway because the parliamentary authorities require you to register it,
After people have voted, that's the point, right?
Well, I don't think there's going to be...
If you do stuff after... If you say, I'll tell you what I stand for and who I'm funded by and what interests I represent after you've voted, that does seem like someone has something to hide, doesn't it?
I don't know. I think actually we should focus on what we're trying to say to the country. I'm not trying to apologise.
You've got 4 years to do that.
I'm not trying to apologise for Keir Starmer. I don't really have a stake in that. But I don't really think it's such a big deal. But
it might not be a big. It might be a big deal. You might have some really sort of disreputable figures giving him cash.
Well, I hope not, because I think he would be.
Of course, I doubt it. But.
Yeah, but I don't see what the harm is in doing it personally. I would just get on with it. If someone's asking the question, why leave it a live issue? Maybe the real politic of it is he's saying.
I reckon it might be Tony Blair,
Well, maybe that is the thing. Maybe Tony Blair's done it.
Quite possible, and I don't think Keir Starmer would have rejected that because he'd be the sort of guy where Tony Blair says,
it could be the fact, because I know Blair was saying that he didn't want to sort of taint any particular candidate with an endorsement, as he saw it. So it might be the case, and... I'm
going to get really conspiratorial, actually. I bet what it was is Tony Blair offered Keir Starmer some money, but he said, don't worry, it won't get publicised until after the campaign, at which point, actually, the fact that I donated to you will be very helpful for you signalling that you're not Corbyn continuity because you were backed by Blair.
Well, we'll soon find out, I suppose.
Rebecca Long-Bailey, you caught him out. We're going to...
do you not think... with the Andrew Neil stuff, the Andrew Neil interviews aren't until next Wednesday?
Yeah,
but that's 10 days after ballots drop. And Rebecca Long-Bailey is equally not confident in herself because she's waiting that long. They're going to do it together. So it's not an attack from Rebecca Long-Bailey attacking Keir Starmer. But the only candidate right now who is not worried and is not kind of quite meek and is willing to take on challenges robustly is Lisa Nandy. And I just feel like if Keir Starmer can't do Andrew Neil relatively early, if he can't disclose his funding, I mean, that doesn't scream confidence, does it?
Well, I think at this stage, from a realpolitik point of view, as I was going to mention earlier on, what has he got? He's got everything to lose at this stage. So by exposing himself to that scrutiny, it puts him at risk. Where, as he's a clear front runner, other candidates who are less ahead in the polling are more likely to want to disrupt that situation. So maybe that's a tactic he's pursuing.
No one's suggesting it's irrational. Obviously, I mean, we've said this a lot on this show. Keir Starmer is running a very intelligent campaign in the sense that he is trying to take the heat out of it. If this leadership election is about unity and no one has a go at anyone else's character, then people are going to go for the safest option, which they're doing at the moment. And he's not going to bother putting himself up for scrutiny, because why would he when he's already winning?
Yeah,
right?
and I think also...
But it's our job to try and say, actually, that's not quite good enough, right? Even obviously we don't have the power to make put himself forward for scrutiny. But I do think that we're not saying it's irrational that Keir Starmer won't go on Andrew Neil, but it would actually be good democratically, I think, and also strategically for the Labour Party. Maybe not for him personally, but for the Labour Party, because we do need to see people tested before they get into that very powerful position.
We have to be very clear that this campaign, which is actually massively too long in my opinion, we're giving way too much bandwidth to the Tories right now to just have control of the narrative, and that was a big mistake that happened in 2015 when they were able to bed in 2010 and 2015, where they were able to bed in certain narratives, particularly in 2010, where they sort of rewrote the history of the financial crash and turning it in from a public debt, from a banking crisis into a public debt crisis, for example. We have to be careful we don't give too much time and media attention to the Tories. And I think if we consume ourselves with internecine nitpicking over these sorts of things, it can often give attack lines to our enemies when we're actually then trying to turn out and take on the Tories and then actually speak meaningfully to the country. So I think it's treading that line as well from a comradely point of view. But I get your concerns. It's a matter for his campaign, obviously. But I don't see what there is to lose personally. But maybe he's made that judgment that it'd be better to hold off.
We're going to talk about coronavirus, COVID-19. It's called COVID-19 now, presumably because they worked out precisely what kind of coronavirus it was, right? Coronavirus is a sort of brand of virus, and this is a specific.
This is a specific
product.
So it's coronavirus identified in 2019, so that's why it's.
Oh, that's why it's 19. Yeah. Oh, that makes so much sense. And what does COVID stand for?
So it's coronavirus identified 19. So it's COVID 19.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, I've learned something already, and the segment has only just begun. This week, coronavirus has gone properly global as global health authorities and global health authorities are preparing for a possible pandemic. There have been 84,000 confirmed cases worldwide, 2,876 deaths at the time of my writing these notes, which was about 2 hours ago. The vast majority of both of these cases and deaths are in China. The next most affected country is South Korea, and Iran has also been badly hit. To be fair, in Iran, we don't actually know how badly they've been hit because it seems like the government aren't being particularly open about the numbers.
They think quarantine is like a bad idea.
Well,
they think it's like outdated.
Yeah. So they're not doing the quarantine. They're too liberal for the kind of
too laissez-faire and open
containment policies that we're going to employ in authoritarian Europe. But I mean, the reason why it's become a massive story now in Britain is partly because it's spreading on a global level, but also it has hit Europe. So there have been 888 cases confirmed in Italy, so especially in those northern Italian towns. Many of them have now been quarantined. 20 cases reported overnight in France, that was last night, and 60 last night in Germany. They're worried today that there could be an outbreak in Britain after a GP in Surrey has become the latest person to become suspected as having come down with COVID-19. That would obviously be a problem because GPs are seeing, constantly those people who are most likely to be affected by coronavirus in a very damaging way. Old people, weak people, people with problems with their immune systems. It is in this context that Boris Johnson has finally made a statement about coronavirus. This was about 2 hours ago on the BBC.
But I just want to reassure everybody and say that the NHS is making every possible preparation. And I actually saw myself some of the works that's being done across the NHS to get ready for that. And as you can imagine, just last night, and as you can imagine, the issue of coronavirus is something that is now the government's top priority. And I've just had a meeting with the Chief Medical Officer, the Secretary of State for Health, and others talking about the preparations that we need to make. And I just really repeat the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, which I think is the best thing to get across. The most valuable thing we can all do to prevent the spread of coronavirus is to wash our hands for 20 seconds or more with hot water and soap. And that's the best single piece of advice we can give.
So that was Boris Johnson, the guy in charge, who has presumably had days to prepare that particular media outing. And all I really took away from it was that we should all wash our hands, which I suppose is, uncontroversial advice, but you'd potentially want something a bit more concrete from the Prime Minister. He also announced today that there would be a Cobra meeting next Monday. He's getting lots of criticism for the fact that that's in quite a while. And it's sort of a similar pattern as with the floods, when he didn't bother going there, he didn't bother really speaking to the media about it, and he doesn't seem to have, come up with any plans. And people are calling him the part-time Prime Minister, to show sort of like how rare or novel it is to have a Prime Minister who is so hands-off in times of national crises. Damien McBride, who I think currently works for Emily Thornberry, but used to be one of the chief advisors to Gordon Brown when he was Prime Minister, wrote a couple of tweets comparing Boris Johnson's approach to Gordon Brown when the foot and mouth outbreak happened. So we can get those tweets up now. Damien McBride says, "This was the basic plan, 7 days a week from the outset of Foot and Mouth 2007, 7 a.m, Cobra meeting chaired by Gordon Brown. Action plan agreed for each day. Gordon Brown briefs opposition leaders. Gordon Brown plus Chief Veterinary Officer, presumably, joint media briefing. Rotation Minister does full media interview round. Gordon Brown clip for evening news." Next tweet. "And that was just the daily routine to assure the public that we were on top of it all. If we had something big to announce, like the expansion of the cull zone or suspending the racing calendar, it was a much bigger exercise. The contrast with the Tories now couldn't be more stark." So you can see that Gordon Brown was pretty busy, got up early, went to an emergency meeting every morning, spoke to the media every day. Boris Johnson, is he lying in? I don't really get what's happening. It seemed like when he first won the election, he was going to be on the front foot in terms of trying to cement his popularity and his majority by saying, "You only lent us your vote, we're going to invest in your communities, etc., etc." Now we've had two national crises and he can't bother to turn up. He's missing in action.
Yeah, he's probably the most lax dilettante we've had as Prime Minister since Alec Douglas-Hume on the grouse moors, you know what I mean? And his behaviour comes across as no surprise. We've even heard, his former employer at the Telegraph editor, is it Max Hastings?
Max Hastings, yeah.
Yeah, he was writing about his character there. It doesn't come across as any surprise that he would be true to form. So in that sense, it provides us with some degree of reassurance that sooner or later, hopefully sooner rather than later, his thoroughly repugnant character will become more obvious to the British public.
Well, we've still got 5 years. We could all be dead by coronavirus by the time that there's a chance for Labour to get back into government. And you two, I suppose, to get back into Glasgow North East.
We'll see.
Is that what you're going to go for?
Probably.
Might as well, eh?
Yeah. I got the smallest swing in Scotland against Labour, so that tells you something.
Very good. The response. So what are the government telling people to do? So far, the main advice has been to self-isolate. If you've come from certain high-risk regions, if you've recently visited certain high-risk regions, or if you've come into contact with someone who might have done or who might have the symptoms of coronavirus. Now, this seems to make sense in terms of slowing down the spread of the disease. It's worked in China, even if that's been done in a slightly more authoritarian way, where they've shut down whole towns.
Built a hospital in 24 hours.
Built a hospital in 24 hours. Although it was suggested to me that was maybe just a PR stunt.
I think so.
They did build the hospital, but I think the Chinese. So you'll have probably seen the clip on social media where there's loads and loads of diggers building a hospital. It's one of those fast forward. What's it called? Speeded up clips. Whatever.
Time lapse. Yeah.
Time lapse clips. That's it. Speedy clips. It's a Chinese speedy clip. And that was showing all of these diggers building a hospital. But someone I know who sort of like works in building was like, those diggers aren't doing anything. They're just sort of going backwards and forwards, and it was the government sort of trying to show how in control they were of the situation.
China is a world leader in additive manufacture for buildings and 3D printing, as we might call it.
They're pretty good at stuff.
I mean, there was one skyscraper. I mean, people forget the New York, the Empire State Building was built in 13 months.
Yeah.
You know, put buildings up with
and below budget.
Yeah, with prefab and stuff. It's quite modular construction. Things
Would have
be
taken
built
longer
quite
here.
quickly. It would take 20 years now in Britain.
In any case, in this country, self-isolation is what is being advised. 14 days off work. The problem with that, as the GMB union pointed out today, is that 14 days off work, or to be able to take 14 days off work, is not a luxury everyone can afford. And also, it's many people on the lowest wages who are most likely to be in environments where they're going to catch coronavirus or might spread it. So you can think of people working in catering, people working in care work, Uber drivers, Deliveroo drivers handling your food. These are people who can't just take 14 days off work because they don't get sick pay in the gig economy. So let's go to GMB's statement today. So this is Mick Ricks, GMB National Officer. The threat of coronavirus is a huge problem for employers and workers across the UK, but workers in the so-called gig economy or on 0 hours contracts are left abandoned and penniless if they have to self-isolate. Once again, the bogus self-employment model is screwing over the disadvantaged. GMB is calling on all employers, regardless of the contract, to do the right thing and pay their workers if they have to take time off due to the global health crisis. Let's go straight actually onto the impact on the US election. So the same issues about low-paid gig economy jobs apply in America. Obviously, you've got the same. Yeah, I mean, you've got even worse pay. You've got people on even more vulnerable contracts there. Mm-hmm. So if they're told to self-isolate, they'll be absolutely screwed. And in any case, that's not just a point about social justice. It's also a practical point, right? If you tell people to self-isolate, but they can't afford to self-isolate, what are they going to do? They're going to go to work. If they go to work, then other people are going to get that virus, and then suddenly you've got a coronavirus epidemic.
And are less likely to access primary care because of the charges.
Exactly. So in the US, this is also feeding in to a big election issue, which is private healthcare and Medicare for all. The leader of the House, Nancy Pelosi, over there, sort of got some flack for saying that if there was a vaccine developed for coronavirus, it would be made affordable. People like, just make it fucking free.
She's worth $100 million.
We're facing a
by the
global
way.
pandemic.
She's worth $100 million.
How did she make that?
I think it's mostly her husband, I think, but that she's amongst the wealthiest sort of figures in the Democratic Party, or indeed in any party.
But the Republicans, what they're saying is that all of this is political point scoring. The Democrats want, 500,000 people to die so they can win the presidential election. They're saying don't make politics out of, a natural disaster, as it were. The problem is Trump isn't very good at not politicizing things. He's also more entertaining to watch than Boris Johnson. So we're going to now see a clip of Donald Trump talking about America's response to coronavirus.
We have, through some very good early decisions that were actually ridiculed at the beginning, and we did it very early. A lot of people thought we shouldn't have done it that early, and we did, and it turned out to be a very good thing. Because of all we've done, the risk to the American people remains very low. The vaccine is coming along well, and we have a total of 15 cases, many of which, almost much within a day, I will tell you, most of whom are fully recovered. I think that's really a pretty impressive mark. And again, when you have 15 people, and the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero, that's a pretty good job we've done. And again, we've had tremendous success beyond what people would have thought.
That was Donald Trump talking about how tremendous his response to coronavirus had been. Good moment where he's talking about how I'm going to make an announcement exactly right now that I'm putting Mike Pence in charge
nice
of
that he now
responses.
Himself.
Yeah, it's good. I'm going to make an announcement exactly right now. I think
he's doing such a great job.
Yeah. I don't know. Who do you think's dealing better with this, Boris Johnson or Donald Trump? I suppose that's setting the bar low. I was saying Keir Starmer setting the bar low by talking about a no-deal Brexit, but that's probably
I think actually
way too low.
It reveals the complete sort of dysfunctionality of these governments. One of the things that I think Brown did very successfully was promote international collaboration, particularly around things around the financial crash, the G20,
and competent people.
Well, yeah, and you just see the kind of collapse in that level of international cooperation, integration. When we're dealing with massive existential crises around climate, around pandemics, where is that level of international cooperation, funding, solidarity? It's just not a feature of our political discourse right now. There should be a global mobilization to deal with these issues because it's something that doesn't recognize national barriers, arbitrary human constructions.
Well, it does recognise national boundaries if you shut them down, which is increasingly the response, right? It's saying...
Are we going to then see a global move towards, isolationism? I don't think that...
Maybe for a 6-month period.
Maybe, but...
Until the summer. What's interesting, actually, is, when I was first looking at this, it's obviously going to get out eventually, but one of the aims of containment is actually just to stop it spreading until the summer, when the hospitals will be less busy. Feels like maybe you should just fund the hospitals enough. They're not in crisis every February, but what can you do?
I mean, what Paul said there just got me thinking. I mean, it's so true. The last major global crisis, 2008, I don't agree necessarily with all the decisions that were taken, but then, nobody knew what the hell was going on. The idea of recapitalizing banks was cooked up by Baroness Federa and Gordon Brown, and the Americans actually took the lead from the Brits on that. Initially, the Americans said, let's just buy all this bad debt, and then the Brits were like, well, we can just recapitalize the banks, guarantee their solvency, and actually that's a much cheaper way of doing it. The bailout was incredibly expensive. We bailed out the bankers, working people have paid the cost ever since, but people were making it up as they went along, and actually it could have been a lot worse. And like you say, the caliber of those people in Britain, in the US, but also you've got this whole populist wave now, right populist wave, Brazil, India. I'm not a huge fan of technocrats. I'm a Democrat, but you do need technocrats to run a global system of 7.5 billion people. So the regimes aren't quite as good as they were. There's an absence of democratic consent for technocrats. You just think, if there is a major, what economists call sort of exogenous shock to the system, whether it was a massive virus, climate change, etc., all these problems, existential challenges we've got, we're coming our way. Nature is now the big exogenous shock of the next 10 years. It doesn't really inspire confidence.
Well, it's another example of why a capitalist system needs moderation, needs fundamental reconstruction. And that's why it has these flaws, because it can't respond to these issues. It's based on assumptions that perpetual growth is a positive thing. That it's going to see an ever increasing global population. The use of resources is insatiable. These are big challenges that we're going to have to confront in a meaningful way in the next century. And I don't think our political system's geared up to deal with that at all. And when you look at pandemics, for example, it's a good example of the issue of where legislations fail to catch up with the social and economic realities faced by working class people, where folk are going to end up, suffering severe hardship. So it's a class distribution of the negative effects of it are going to be felt more keenly by the working class. Where's legislation to protect workers? Are we seeing that challenged in Parliament? Are we going to see legislation passed to oblige these gig economy employers to compensate workers who are off work in that way? Are we going to see a national fund established to ensure that there's a transfer of wealth from rich people to poor people who are suffering as a result of not being able to work in a freelance or self-employed basis as a result of it? I don't see any effort on that front to sort of address those looming issues. They don't just affect people suffering from the coronavirus. It's a more general issue about healthcare and looking after the population.
Although ultimately, I suppose in a kind of a macabre analysis of how equality is achieved, when lots of people die from plagues, that's often quite good for equality historically. I think the Great Plague, so many people died that wages had to rise. You end up with a much more empowered working class. But I think there are a few ways to get equality. One is wars that kill loads of people. The other is plagues that kill loads of people, and one is just organising in a trade union. So probably the third option is
also modern revolutions.
The better one.
Modern revolutions tend to happen actually when there's a slight uptick in living standards. So the French Revolution, 1789, you had famine and so on in the 1770s, earlier in the 18th century. Actually, 1789, things were looking up for the French people. And that's when the revolution happened. Similar situation in England in the 50s, 60s. Similar with the American Revolution in the 1770s. Actually, this idea of, accelerating the contradictions. When things get really bad, people will rise up.
Well, isn't it after they get really bad? So if you look at the Second World War, right, it's that you had a situation where, you have a very powerful state, because both in a war economy or in a plague situation, you have a very powerful overbearing state that has to, take control of the economy and industry far more than previously. If we have a situation where the British government are going to have to be quarantining certain towns and supply chains completely break down because things aren't being imported from other countries where there are, coronavirus outbreaks, then you are going to have much more of a planned economy, just as you do in a war. Then afterwards, people will be like, oh, we've survived coronavirus. Maybe we deserve a better future than what neoliberalism offered us before. In any case, I'm not hoping for any of this because it won't be worth it.
Well,
hopefully the pandemic is resolved. We'll have 5 normal years of a Tory government and then Labour will win on a positive vision.
Perhaps. Well, as Tony Benn said, educated, healthy and confident nation is harder to govern.
Fair.
Maybe a point there.
Rick Lyons tweets on the hashtag TyskySour, I would love to see Keir Starmer QC question Keir Starmer leadership candidate and see whether the barrister Keir would let candidate Keir get away with the kind of slippery nonsense answers he keeps offering to key questions.
He does give loyally answers to things, and on the one hand, that's good. Sometimes you do want to be, a little bit clever in your answers, but sometimes you do. Again, it's what Lisa Nandy's been quite good at. Just a 1-2 word answer to something.
I think there's been some interesting. He's obviously doing it in a very controlled way, but there's been some good things that have come out. For example, a commitment to federalism, a constitutional convention, which is the looming big issue in this country's future. No one's really addressed. And also, seems to be committed to an idea of electoral reform, which is the other big elephant in the room where first past the post has had its day in this country, where we're getting repeated popular votes in favour of centre-left governments, yet the Tories keep winning on first past the post. I think that's producing a social tension. And then in Scotland, you have the SNP on 45% of the popular vote, but win 80% of the seats. The Labour vote in Scotland is 95% unrepresented. That's not sustainable for this country. So these are the kind of big challenges I think certainly he's introduced. But how are we going to grasp that as a movement? I think that's going to be a big issue. And I don't think we've necessarily seen answers to those questions. I'd like to see more creative ideas about how we move forward on that. And I think in Scotland, when we've heard the word federalism for the last 5 years, people just roll their eyes now because it's just a technocratic buzzword. It's something you hear in a university politics lecture. What does it mean what's the future constitution of this country going to look like in the nuts and bolts? This party needs to quickly get a grip of that and spell out to people what it means. Otherwise, we're going to be doomed.
And also, how do you make it popular? The idea of, and I agree with Keir Starmer's idea of a constitutional convention. It was Labour policy at the last election. So I'm not going to say, when Jeremy Corbyn offered it, it was a good idea, and now Keir Starmer. I'm not saying that at all. But,
I don't think we can wait for government either. I think we need to get on with it now because we need to have something that's ready-made, oven-ready, if you like, going into the next election.
Well, although the biggest argument against that, and I'm all in favour of PR and constitutional reform, but the public don't really care about it.
That's not true.
They didn't care about Brexit before it was made into an issue by the Tories.
English Parliament.
I think if you do an English Parliament, then you wrap it up with some cultural issues that people might care about. I think Labour should probably announce English Parliament, Scottish Parliament, Welsh Parliament. Give everyone a Parliament, and then we'll have some sort of federal.
Well, Andrew Adonis had a really interesting point where he said that West Germany's federal system was designed by Ernst Bevin, after the Second World War, but the only way it worked was by dismantling Prussia, because it was such an overbearing state in Germany that. And the same issue is
England would be Prussia.
England's so overbearing, would you actually have to dismantle it into sort of Yorkshire, Lancaster,
the heptarchy?
But he was imposing that system in a destroyed.
Yeah,
it was if you were going to technocratically design what would be the perfect constitutional reform you'd do for Britain, it wouldn't have an English Parliament. But if you're a Labour Party trying to get support for constitutional reform, you have to tap into some identities that already exist because this isn't a defeated country after a world war.
That's a fair point, but
with a foreign power, it was basically a reason that the Foreign Secretary of Britain designed that system for Germany, and it wasn't something that emerged grassroots from the German
Paul's point
public.
Is it's endured 75, 80 years.
Yeah, well, I think if we had, my problem isn't whether it can endure; it's how you bring it about in the first place. In a democratic system, how do you get PR and all this constitutional reform that no one has any emotional attachment to, unless you attach it to an identity that people care about, which is the argument for an English Parliament.
Personally, I would also adopt another German tradition, which is to do away with referendums and actually put it in a manifesto as part of a wider package for reform of this country and say, if we win a mandate for it, we're going to deliver it. But also a big part of that as well has to be building an electoral alliance with other centre-left parties, because if we're going to win in 2024, we're going to have to get a bigger swing than 1997. And realistically, the only way that's going to be achieved is through some sort of electoral pact with other centre-left parties to have a non-aggression pact, essentially.
Are the Lib Dems a centre-left party?
Well, it depends what way they're going to go. Are we able to nail them down on some commitments? That's a key thing for us. Are they willing to actually agree on non-Tory agenda That's maybe a way of building that coalition. But from a realistic point of view, we have to win on first past the post at the next election. How are we going to achieve that when we need a bigger swing than 97? And that's something we're going to have to confront. Some pretty big fundamental issues. We're going to slaughter some sacred cows on that regard, about our commitment to stand a Labour candidate in every constituency. Maybe that needs to be challenged.
Our final topic for the evening, before we go to some of your questions and comments, is Bolivia. So last November, as I explained in the beginning, there were presidential elections in Bolivia. Morales claimed victory. The army said, no, it was rigged. They forced him to stand down. Aaron is going to talk about how left-wing figures in this country said, look, this is a coup. He was democratically elected and the army have overthrown him. And many people, let's say with other shades of politics, said Jeremy Corbyn's an idiot. Why is he defending someone who's just rigged an election? Talk us through it, Aaron.
Yeah. So I'm sure you remember it's from last year. We'll get a tweet up from Jeremy Corbyn if that's all right. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn, typically astute when it came to matters of foreign policy, to see at Evo es Pueblo, who, along with a powerful movement, has brought so much social progress, which is inarguable in Bolivia, forced from office by the military is appalling. I against the Bolivian people and stand with them for democracy, social justice, and independence. On the hashtag El Mundo con Evo, the world with Evo. Evo Morales being the president of Bolivia, 15,500 retweets. And then you can sort of laugh and look at people in the comments being abusive to him. What's interesting is that was very much at odds with what you see from, for instance, The Guardian's diplomatic editor, Patrick Wintour, who had his own take on it, saying, whatever his record as president, and he's retweeting Jeremy Corbyn saying this, ballot stuffing is wrong. So this take on Bolivia by the Labour leader is truly startling. The Organization of American States, more on them in a second, found a, quote, heap of observed irregularities in the October 20th election and said a new vote should be held. Then adding to that, the Observer view on Evo Morales and Bolivia, and it talks about how Morales didn't deserve to rule any longer and that there was some legitimacy to him being overthrown. Now, unlike The Guardian, unlike The Observer, The Washington Post does original journalism. So they went to the MIT, maybe Fox can bring up the Washington Post page. They went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and they have determined in a study that actually there was no electoral fraud in the October presidential election, casting doubt on the prior findings, as I've said, issued by the Organization of American States. They found that Evo Morales did indeed win in the first round of voting. And they've thrown out the OAS accusation that Morales' government manipulated the results. So we're not talking Novara Media, Squawk Box, The Canary. This is Washington Post and MIT. You don't get more legitimate, authoritative liberal institutions in the world, right, saying that actually Morales won and he was subject to an undemocratic coup. And it's just interesting to see that, politicians can make wrong calls. Jeremy Corbyn's called some things wrong before. But the instinct of certain people within the sort of centrist punditocracy to attack him and lambast him and say, you're wrong, oh my God, you're always on the wrong side, really illustrates the complete vacuity that they have when it comes not just to principles, but to political literacy in regards to foreign affairs. Corbyn on this issue, as so often elsewhere, has been proven correct. The likes of David Aronovich, The Guardian, The Observer, and many, many more of these people who perceive themselves to be on the left, I would argue on foreign policy or anything but, have found to be on the wrong side.
Did you show the tweet from Dominic Raab, our current foreign secretary?
Dominic Raab's going to talk shit, but the take for me was more the left establishment media being terrible. But I think you should. That is true. But then also the fact that you've got the current foreign secretary. So you've got Dominic Raab here. It's probably a bit late to get it up, but I'll put it in anyway. He has quote tweeted the Jeremy Corbyn tweet that you read out and said, unbelievable, the Organization of American States refused to certify the Bolivian election because of systemic flaws. The people are protesting and striking on an unprecedented scale, but Jeremy Corbyn puts Marxist solidarity ahead of democracy. It turns out Jeremy Corbyn was just backing a leader who had just won a free and fair election to become president.
And what Dominic Raab, was doing was during a general election, even though he is the foreign secretary, that's his job. He's the kind of guy who should actually, be a bit more careful about saying that an election is illegitimate. He used it as a cheap shot against the leader of the opposition, and he's been proved wholly wrong. And I await an apology from Dominic Raab.
It just shows you the ideology.
I doubt it's going to come.
Yeah, the ideology at the heart of it is sickening. One of the documentaries I grew up with was watching War on Democracy by John Pilger about the kind of systematic manipulation of democratic processes in South America by what the United States regarded as its backyard. It was a kind of neo-colonial approach to running South America. Most notably Salvador Allende's coup against him, and interesting connections that have emerged with the Rolls-Royce workers in Scotland, for example, and efforts to sort of express solidarity with that back in the 1970s. But I think the key thing for me was even looking at Mark Weiss wrote a really good Twitter thread on this, and he's written extensively about this Bolivian election, where he's making the point that the process itself was flawed and people jumped on the initial results because it was a quick count phase, which was ideally meant to give the population confidence that the votes were being counted and there was a real-time process, because in Bolivia and some South American countries it takes several days for the eventual results to emerge. But that actually caused real confusion in this election because there was a big rural-urban divide in the way the votes were counted, so that actually the support that Morales was getting was actually lagging because he was getting the rural vote and it took longer to bring in. And that's where the Organization of American States then came in and said, it wasn't possible for him to make that jump in the final third of the votes counted. And that's where they started to throw all these kind of shades of doubt onto the contest, and that's where eventually the whole thing fell apart. So it's interesting that the very gold standard processes that were insisted on by the OAS have actually ended up undermining the confidence in the election. And it was Morales that agreed to the rerun, and still the army stepped in, and it wasn't like he was resisting another electoral test, but the army nonetheless stepped in and removed him. I think that's in anyone's definition a coup d'etat. And
presumably the Organization for American States, their judgment that this was an illegitimate election has something to do with the fact that there's been an enormous shift to the right in terms of the parties who make up the Organization of American States, right? So you've got Bolsonaro next door, the Ecuador, which used to be a strong ally of left-wing Bolivia, is now led by someone who seems to be much more accommodating towards the United States and their interests. That's Lenin Moreno. He's one of the reasons why Julian Assange got kicked out of the Ecuadorian embassy. He replaced, Rafael Correa. Everyone thought he was a leftist. He was sort of the anointed successor to Rafael Correa. They thought he was a leftist, and then as soon as he got into power, he turned out to be a neoliberal.
Mexico's doing okay.
With AMLO. Let's go to some of your questions. So you can ask your questions in the comment section, or you can go to #TyskySour on Twitter with your questions and comments there. Chris Jenkin asks, now this is a difficult question, I'm not sure if any of us are going to know the answer to this. Do you think there's any chance of Bolivia returning to socialist government now that it's been proven the last election was legitimate?
I would hope in a free and fair election that clearly the popular vote was supporting left-wing candidates, so hopefully that would be the case. But it's difficult to tell how it would play out.
I mean, I'd say that's very unlikely. I mean, the problem with, or why, the army have an advantage in these kind of situations is because once you've done a coup, people are going to be very resistant to undoing it, aren't they? And if you think, maybe there'll be international pressure, there's never going to be international pressure to reinstate a leftist government, right? So it's the kind of thing where if this had been done by the left, the United States would be there, at the Security Council saying, you've got to redo this, you've got to redo this. But if it's Evo Morales who lost out, a leftist who's resistant to their imperial power in that continent, then, I mean, I'm not an expert on Bolivian politics, but my guess would be, they're not going to right that wrong.
Also, he's been ruled ineligible to run for the National Assembly. There are elections this year, and then this interim government panel, whatever it is, assembly.
Well, it was originally ruled ineligible because of the term limits.
Yeah.
But then that was ruled by the court to be unconstitutional, and that itself was then challenged. It was like, but in Bolivia, the judges are elected. It's not like where Trump stuffs the Supreme Court with cronies who are going to lock in a sort of hard right agenda. So there was even a democratic check on the judiciary, which ruled that he was able to run and eligible to run. So it's bizarre that he would then be ruled unable to stand in the election. You know, why shouldn't he be allowed to come back?
The National Electoral Tribunal doesn't sound particularly authoritative. But yeah, he can't run as a senator this year.
This is a good question from Ratbum. Any ideas on non-authoritarian responses to pandemics? I can't really see any way that you don't have to forcibly quarantine. Oh, you deleted it before I'd finished it. Forcibly quarantine some people or areas. It's a very good question. I mean, I'm finding now actually the coronavirus issue. For a while, I was sort of like, this is for medical people. I don't really understand what's going on. But now it's become this enormous political question. It's incredibly interesting.
Well, I attracted a lot of controversy in Parliament where I suggested that vaccination should be compulsory.
Oh, yeah.
And I got so much shit for that.
Really? From who?
From just loads of people online.
From anti-vaxxers online?
Yeah.
Oh
and
God.
I just, when you think of that suggestion, which is there's a herd issue there, herd immunity.
Well, that would be a popular policy nationally, I think, in this country.
Yeah.
Whenever it comes up on sort of like radios or talk shows, because people kind of like that. Because the vaccine story, if you're not following it, I mean, you probably are, is it's growing the number of parents who don't want their children to get vaccinated because they're worried that it might cause autism, or this whole association between the MMR,
This particular vaccine
and autism became. It's completely discredited, but it's had a sort of lasting effect. And because there are some people who medically can't be immunized, and so these parents who don't get their kids immunized, they're putting at risk the kids who can't be immunized, right? But I think actually the public like that in general because it's this sort of like authoritarian, punishing irresponsible parents, which is
in
like
a good
always a very populist
in a
kind
good
of
way.
line. Well, that I think
There are rules, and if you
case,
don't play by them, it means other people get screwed over. Fuck you.
In that case, it aligns in a way that is good. There was a very interesting...
no, because the people that don't give their kids these immunisations, their kids aren't the ones that get sick. It's other people's kids. Because they might be fine. They pass it on to somebody else, and then
Look, the Novara Media line is make vaccinations mandatory. All right?
Good.
There's no debate there. There's an article in the New York Times about this very question of sort of like quarantining people, which I thought was good today. And the headline was, to take on coronavirus, go medieval on it. Quarantines and restrictive measures served a purpose in the old days. They can now too. And it goes on. There are two ways to fight epidemics, the medieval and the modern. The modern is to surrender to the power of the pathogens, acknowledge that they are unstoppable, and try to soften the blow with 20th century inventions, including new vaccines, antibiotics, hospital ventilators, and thermal cameras searching for people with fevers. The medieval way, inherited from the era of the Black Death, is brutal. Close the borders, quarantine the ships, pen terrified citizens up inside their poisoned cities. And they're saying for the first time in more than a century, we're going for the medieval one. And also, seems to be working. So they're like, it does seem like the medical establishment do think that the Chinese brutal quarantine did significantly slow down the spread of this virus. I mean, you can be critical of authoritarian responses as well, because you can have two kinds of authoritarian responses, right? You can have one which is, a compassionate one done in an egalitarian way, which gives a shit if once you've locked someone in a house, they've got enough food. Or you can have one where it says, well, lock everyone in the city, and then, it's for the greater good that some of them will just perish in their homes. So are you in favour of quarantining people? I think it might be necessary.
Although I think there were quite extreme options you were presenting there. No, I think controlling movement is obviously a critical component of a public health approach, but obviously there has to be ensuring that they're well looked after within that quarantine zone. You can't really just leave them to perish, whatever. I think there's got to be an approach where, controlling movement of the population internationally is a big issue.
They have been really. Did you read about the boat?
There was a British citizen that died in Japan. Today.
But there was great again. I'm here advertising the New York Times. Well, they've got shitloads of money. If you want to spend some money, spend it on Novara Media.
We're broke. 5.5 million subscribers.
But in any case, they had a good article about this cruise ship. And they're saying basically everyone got quarantined on the cruise ship, but all the workers were quarantined on it as well. But the workers, they made them, clean all the sheets, clean all the clothes. They had to really submit themselves to the disease, which one meant that about 80 odd workers got coronavirus, and two, because they were going from room to room to room to room to room, they gave coronavirus to all of the people working there. So it to me seems like possibly a foretaste of what we might be in store for, which is the bosses saying, look, the workers don't look. The workers still have to work, even if there's coronavirus. Then ultimately, that gives coronavirus to everyone.
Well, it's a good point about can you not test people who are acutely infected and ensure they're isolated from people who are at risk? There's different categories of isolation there. By lumping everyone together, you actually put more people at risk from the people who are definitely infected. It seems like a perverse approach. So I guess that's where there's a degree of nuance there, isn't there?
Quarantine everyone, make Netflix free, and then I suppose you could just ramp up the production of fuel, get that to houses.
But it's also that it's not medieval in so much as China has probably, we don't know, but China's probably used huge amounts of big data in terms of analysing who goes where, what to stop, when to open it, etc. And so I think that, it's authoritarian, it's backwards looking. I mean, it may be they will be using cutting edge 21st century technology. And in terms of, societies around the world collaborating together to respond to these things. By the way, this is the future, right? We are only about 60 years into a properly integrated global economy, not just with real-time communications, but with jet travel, et cetera, containerization. I mean, when we have really effective bioweapons and so on, this is going to be a really salient issue that people have to talk about intelligently.
It's actually a really interesting issue. I was visiting China with a cross-party delegation in August, and we went to visit a Chinese tech company called Inspur, and they were showing us some of their integrated healthcare applications and some of the technologies they were using, and they're way in advance of anything that's deployed in the UK. So, for example, millennials are less likely to access their GP because it's really inconvenient to book appointments. There's no live real-time visibility. They've got apps where you can book appointments at hospitals, access your medical records using a kind of app like Uber or Spotify. It's all readily available on your phone. And you're thinking, why are we so far behind? Actually, for a national monopoly, which the NHS is, it's really low. It's really low integration.
Why do you think that is?
Because it's split into. It's because it's marketized. There's an internal bullshit market that operates within the NHS. So you get different trusts buying different technologies, different systems from different vendors, and actually you would achieve much more national power from integrating it and having an integrated system. Standardization across the whole network of the NHS.
So New Labour was wrong on its sort of internal
absolutely, and that's why
it's
actually why Scottish Labour resisted the marketisation of the NHS and why it's still got a much more integrated system and why it generally performs far better than the English equivalent.
I don't know what to make of this question. Jose Amidio asks, I nearly killed my supervisor by flu in January. I think I'm going to kill him next year. Thoughts?
I don't know if you can weaponize it in that way.
Well, I mean, is the implication that it's kind of the supervisor's fault for being? And I mean, loads of people are saying this, right? That if you work in an industry where you're not treated very well, or you work behind a bar, or you work in a kitchen, or whatever, your boss doesn't just say, "Oh, okay, fine, stay home for the day." If you don't turn up that day, there's shed loads of moral pressure to turn up. If you don't turn up for like 9 times a year or 4 times a year in some jobs, you have to have a meeting with your manager and it causes you real problems. So this idea that, you can just self-quarantine for 14 days, it just doesn't, it doesn't seem plausible.
It's another example of the tragedy of the commons where, the profit motive and self-interest can often cause harm to the collective. And I think that's another example where capitalism needs controlled.
Can I say we had, and also these people, they tend to be the super spreaders, well, it's apparently a made up term. A couple of weeks before the general election in Portsmouth South, my partner was involved in some local campaigning there. There was a fundraiser. Turns out one of the workers working in this pub was very ill. And before you know it, 15 campaigners and activists are all sick.
All right.
And obviously that worker had no choice. They had to go to work. There was the pressure, the fact it's minimum wage, etc. But yeah, the very people who will be under the most pressure to do this stuff, cashiers, food workers, etc. It's care workers. It's a big deal.
It's like still held the seat though.
He did. He tripled his. So I want to get him on because he is. The whole ultra Remain argument. It seemed to fail. But then there are some seats where actually they leaned into the Lib Dem vote, they leaned into the progressive vote, and the
Alex
whole.
Sobell's another good example.
Yeah, I mean that Canterbury, obviously people know about that. Sheffield.
Yeah.
And so the sort of argument, which I don't know where I stand on, I probably disagree with it. But Labour I don't think Labour ever could have won a majority, but Labour could have done much better if they'd not done the dither and delay thing and just gone full Remain earlier on. I mean, yeah, Stephen Morgan and Portsmouth South probably. If there's an example of that, it's probably there.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We're going to wrap up, guys. It's a Friday night. Fox needs to go. We all need to go.
Time flies.
Paul Sweeney, it's been a pleasure.
Pleasure.
We'll get you back down in. You still live in Glasgow, right?
Yeah,
But we'll
still
get you back
there.
down in London
Yeah,
soon.
sounds good.
Aaron Bastani, always a pleasure. We'll be back on Monday. I won't be here. Aaron will be hosting the show. We've got Zara Sultana on. Anyone else?
I think Dahlia.
Oh, great. Fabulous. So come back on Monday. I'll be back on Wednesday. Have a wonderful weekend and good night.